Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Jarosław Danilczuk. I work for DataArt as a software developer. I'm in .NET for the last many years, more than 10 years, and you can say my hobby, my main interest is security. And today's talk will be an awareness talk about the security and the solutions. Why managed identity? Why I chose this topic? I'm talking to many developers, colleagues of mine, also .NET developers from other companies, and I see that people don't know, are not aware that there exists a very simple solution to provide a secure access and secure authentication to resources in Azure. Accessing resources in a secure way is hard. We all know that this is a no-go. Yeah? We don't enter credentials into our source code because it's committed, other people can see it. Some junior developers do, when they are told this is wrong, and let's say they understood this is wrong, they do something like this. They just move the credentials to the config file, and they hope that during development, of course, don't do it. They hope that the development credentials will be changed in the production, that some kind of deployment systems will replace those keys, like for example, Octopus replaces them. But still, those credentials exist on dev machine. They are well known to many people. This is not the way of doing this. And how many of you use Azure at the moment, code for Azure? Wow, great, great. And anybody tried managed identity before? You do like this. Don't do this, please. I can explain. You replace it or put the environment variables. Okay, so I will refer to that later on. Thank you that you mentioned about it. Some people, when they read the Azure documentation and they are looking for the information on security, how to secure access, how to store credentials, Azure Key Vault, huge marketing some time ago. Now it's not that huge, but is it a secure way of storing credentials? Of course. There are hardware security models. You can store any values there. Microsoft has a policy of not accessing the software-based solution, hardware-based solutions they cannot access physically. Yeah? So we all know there is a simple solution. So why to look for any further? Because the problem stays. You need to connect to Azure Key Vault. And people do something like that. Client secret, client ID, connect to the Key Vault. So the problem stays. It's exactly the same. Yeah, we just moved everything to the Key Vault. Our bill has raised. We pay more money. We're happy, but the security is still exactly the same. In past times, I see most of you are young people. But if you did some development for the corporate environment, you probably used Active Directory. And connecting to SQL Server or to file resources was very simple because you just put in the connection string Windows authentication, no credentials needed. Yeah? And the connection was in the context of the user. How it worked? Anyone did it for Active Directory? Not yet. Okay. I'll tell about it because Microsoft solution, of course, resembles this. When you have domain controller in Active Directory in corporate environment, the application or user has some kind of identity. It always runs in the context, service user or the physical user. The procedure goes this way. When you are logged into the station or you are service with the user and password in the services, you ask the domain controller for the token. Usually the mechanism for getting those tokens is called Kerberos. If you haven't read about it, you can read about it, but It's not, if you want to go deep into the technology, it's complex. Use of this is simple. You get this token and you present this token to the resource, for example, SQL Server. And the SQL Server can either verify the signature of the domain, so it doesn't need to have this connection, or it can actively ask domain, did you issue this token? Those tokens expire, they should be refreshed, so the security is preserved. This is how it's done in corporate environments on premises, when there is a domain controller. Yeah? But then the cloud happened for the developers who did only on-prem. We set up our own infrastructure. We are most of the times allowed to spin up new VMs, to run new storage accounts, to run SQL instances. We do it on our own, and we do it like that. That's great, yeah? No admins needed anymore. But what about security? The thing that someone has thought about it before. Now when we do it on our own, or some fresh interns just spin up those resources. How about security? How about authentication? And usually the answer is it's admin's job, it's DevOps job, it's someone else's job. I'm the developer. Why should I think about it? You should. It's not their job. It's your job if you spin those things. Because at the end of the day, when the client's data is suddenly public, they will ask you who created this code, who allowed this. They will not ask who was admin at that point of time. They will ask you. And you don't want to be in such news. Most of data breaches are because of two things. The first cloud was AWS, and the default setting for S3 bucket was public. Because Amazon thought this will be used for just as a CDN to deliver files. But people started storing files there, and many people forgot to make it private. They didn't want to make passwords because in the development it took time. Yeah? You needed to pass this password to someone. It was complex. The other source of data breaches is that the credentials. For example, if there is a group of 20 developers and all of them see the credentials, the main credentials to the database or to the file store, suddenly this app goes to the production because deadline was 2 months ago, and nobody changes those credentials. Yeah? And they fired, of course, developers because they did their job and went home. Yeah? So what they do with those credentials? They sell it and have a nice vacation in Caribbean. Yeah? And then the news report. We have your data. We have your private data. We have confidential data that has business value or some personal inclinations. And that's where Azure Managed Identity comes in. Of course, Microsoft knows corporate environments. That's where it made its money and still making most of its money. And it had to find a solution, an easy-to-use solution for cloud environments. Because some companies try to replicate Active Directory with domain controllers in Azure. It doesn't work. It's just not this way of doing things. So what is Azure Managed Identity? The schema of working is exactly the same as for the old Active Directory. It's the only difference is that all the cloud resources like VM, app service, logic apps, or other have to ask someone something for this token. And Microsoft created, for example, for VM, this is extensions. For other services, this is endpoint. This is IP endpoint. In a few minutes, you'll see more details how it works. So the schema of authentication is exactly the same. Code asks the endpoint for the token. In fact, it asks Azure Active Directory, gets this token, and uses it to access the service. The token has expiry date, etc. No need to store the credentials. This code always runs in context of some either resource or some user. You probably know this window. When you create Azure resources, there's for resources that support identity, there is this simple thing, identity. System assigned, on. That's all you need to do to make the resource use it. What happens then? This resource receives an ID, GUID, just a number that and is uniquely identified in the system. What can you do next? For example, you need to access the storage account. That's how you do it for people, to give them access? Exactly. You set up the role storage blob data reader, you choose type, and you pick up. And then on the list of people and services that can read is, for example, our app and physical users. This way you can give access to the developer. This way you give access to the application, and it's not only Azure App Service that's involved. It can be also virtual machine. It can be virtual machine set. I will show you in a moment how many services supported. 1 year ago, it was just VM. You had to enable the extension that was still in the preview. Now it's the general availability. It can be run in production for that many services. Probably if you create .NET apps, you use either app service, virtual machines, or functions. These are the most frequently used, and they were supported as first. API management, but also if you like containers, container instances and registry tasks, only for Linux at the moment. Windows is in preview. You can see the new Microsoft here. Yeah, Linux goes first, the rest goes after, but that's the truth. Yeah, containers are Linux. Windows is too heavy to put into containers. So all those services, as of yesterday, support manage identity. So you can, for each of those resources, either when you spin up resources with the command line or with the GUI, with the Azure portal, you can just make enable manage identity, and suddenly they receive this this magic. But these are services that need to access resources. What can we access using manage identity? Resource Manager, of course, to spin up the next ones, but Key Vault, one of the first that supported it. Yeah? Microsoft seen the issue. Storage services, blobs, queues, tables, Event Hub Service Bus. This is very important because when you have many services, like in microservice architectures that communicate over service bus, storing credentials for spinned instances is almost impossible, and for sure it's not secure. And one of the latest is Azure SQL. It also supports the managed identity. Like in the corporate environment, you could use Windows authentication. You can now, for Azure SQL, choose use managed identity. There are two kinds of managed identity. On the previous slide, you've seen this user assigned and system assigned. Now the preview is gone. What is the difference? The system assigned is as simple as switching on. It's created as it's part of the resource. You just create it and it has it, like the GUID. But it cannot be shared. If you want to spin, for example, 100 machines to do some tasks, each of them will have separate identity, and allowing dynamically them to access a single resource is also time consuming. You need to specify this. That's why Microsoft added, about a year after they initiated the Managed Identity project, they added user assigned. What is user assigned managed identity? The name is not too fortunate because I would call it a role. You define a role. The role can exist without the user, without the object. Yeah? You just define a name. For example, our app. And this role, this user managed identity, can be assigned to any resource. So for example, when you spin up 100 of VM instances, you can create them, assigning them this user managed identity, assigning them a role, and then you only allow the role to access, for example, files or database. So it can be shared, and it's very important for scalable environments. Yeah? And now the how to use it from the .NET. Yeah? As I told you at the beginning, I hear from developers, but yeah, we'll just put credentials into the config, into the code. It's faster, it's simpler. I'll show you the examples, and then after that, you'll tell me which is simpler and faster for the developer. At first, because all of us like reading someone else's code, yeah? It's fun, it's always fun. So instead of drawing diagram, I prepared you some kind of someone else's code. It's not mine, so you'll see it. But first, important thing: SDKs, libraries, and namespaces for anything regarding Azure. Please remember about it, because some of people, lots of examples, still use this namespace. Microsoft, Windows, Azure. I took storage as an example. This one is now obsolete. Obsolete in terms it won't be developed any further. And I know that 90% of examples on the internet are using those classes. And believe me, they are different than what Microsoft recommends now. But I knew about it in November 2018. So I even advised some people from Microsoft, why don't you use new libraries you recommend yourself? Great. I was using those libraries. I recommended it to my colleagues. And recently, I noticed that Microsoft did another namespace. You see, those things are evolving. That's why I put this. I added this slide specifically. Use this one. This one looks like it will be a long-term supported Azure SDK. That's my advice. Don't be afraid if you see an example with this, because in documentation there are some mappings how to move from this one to this one. You can even see that the middle namespace, Microsoft Azure, had different versioning. Yeah, they started it from 1, but then suddenly I believe they realized they should continue versioning from that. So please be aware of that, and use the newest one. You'll have the best tools possible. So this is someone else's code. I did it instead of diagram to show you. Yeah, exactly. It's not the prettiest, but this one will show you how it works under the hood. I told you that for Azure Managed Identity, the resource, the code needs to make a request for the token. And this is the code. You see, there's a hard-coded IP. This IP is from the private namespace. That's how it all happens under the hood. Your code makes a request to a virtual IP, and we know that all Azure is virtual, network interfaces, network itself. So if anything makes a request to this IP, Azure translates it and makes it a request to manage identity. There is a resource specified, and of course, in the reply, you get somewhere access token. Yeah? There is such an example on Microsoft documentations, and it also has this text not recommended. Yeah? If you have really legacy code that doesn't accept any new libraries, you can do it this way. But I told you it should be easy. It should be easy. So you can connect to SQL using this token, just putting it into connection string. This code does exactly the same what the previous one. And this is from the oldest library, so you can use it even in .NET 4.5. Yeah? I don't think you use older than 4.5. You need to specify the resource you want the token. You just spin the Azure Service Token Provider and get access token. Simple and clean. What is simpler? Putting credentials and passing them to your colleague, and then making sure that the continuous deployment changes them, or this. Another method of accessing, because of course those tokens expire. Yeah, don't forget about it. And on the longer running services, which is real services, production services, tokens expire, and they need to be requested again. The Key Vault client had it from the beginning because it was one of the first. That's why it supports all the methods. We create a token provider. This class should be long-lived. This should be persistent, or at least the request. The scope should be at least for the request. and you provide the callback. What the Key Vault client does, calls the methods of Azure Service Token Provider whenever it has problem. It has network problem, or the token expired, or it's rejected, it will retry and throw exception only when this is really a permanent error. So all the job is done for us. Why shall we use any password and username? It's just a different way of thinking. Even more, look at that. This is just a config file. That's nothing else than the .NET config file. What do we have here? App authentication, SQL app authentication provider. This way you can connect to the SQL server without changing anything in the code. You don't need to ask in the code for any token. You just put it into config. The connection string doesn't contain any credentials, any at all. And like in the old times, authentication equals Windows authentication. Now it says Active Directory Interactive. And your application connects to the SQL server, no credentials stored, no connection strings to be replaced in production. One step less to fail. Blob access, for example. Blobs have its own storage credentials. This is old class. It will be changed, or is changed even as we speak, is being changed. We create the token credentials, storage credentials, and we just access blob. Yeah, and that's it. If you wrap it into the class that abstracts your storage, you don't need to care about anything. But all those methods I showed you require you, of course, except the SQL Server, require you to change something in the code. Yeah? Because you told me that you use environment variables, for example, during deployment. So in this newest namespace, Azure, there is a class, default Azure credential, the magic class. What does it do? It takes into consideration that you don't like changing the code, or you will not migrate to the managed identity immediately and for every service. What does class do? First, it checks environment variables. Why? Because it's one of the most popular methods of giving those credentials. So you're not alone. Yeah? Many companies are doing this. If this environment variable is not available, it will ask manage identity. Please give me a token and try to authenticate with it. If it is not possible, then it will try to look for username and password in the configuration, etc. This one magic class from the newest library does all the job for you. So you can change the code now, still use your environment variables, and once you convince your company to move to manage identity and get rid of those environment variables, it's just a matter of configuration of resources. You will not have to change the code later on. Yeah? You don't need to synchronize migration of access and your code. And this is very convenient. But when I was shown my managed identity first, I asked the right question. But I'm a developer. Let's say I have rights to access storage or SQL Server, but I'm running code. My code is that small that I can run it on my local machine, on my dev machine. Sometimes in remote locations, my machine is not controlled by Azure. It's controlled by my own corporate admins. Yeah? It's connected to my local domain. What should I do? So if I won't be able to access resources the same method as the production code, I need to write to branches. Doesn't make any sense. Yeah? You know the screen. Sometimes you look at it when you install Visual Studio for the first time, and you should look at it again. The Visual Studio allows you to add accounts. If you are given access to Azure resource, you need to be given a user and probably two-factor authentication secured account. Yeah? You just put it into Visual Studio. What happens next? The Visual Studio automatically That's how I like to call it. When you run your code, it runs this code in the context of your identity. So if you have rights to access to the resource, your code locally run will also be able to access it. You don't need to change the code. Is it harder than typing credentials? No. And awareness is one of the goals of this talk. But let's assume that you don't have that you are running the older version of Visual Studio that was less aware of Azure, or you have some specific credentials that you cannot enter into Visual Studio. Of course, Microsoft thought about it because the developers are the main source of money for the Microsoft in corporate environments. There's such a thing as Azure command line interface. Yeah? You see how long this command line is. Yeah, it's that small that I can't even handle this pointer. AZ login. What happens next? It's not shown in here, but again, automatically the browser appears. It lets you log in into Azure with the credentials you were given, and then you have this nice message. You have logged in. Then it lists you all the subscriptions you have. Of course, this command line can be much, much longer. Yeah? It can have many parameters. You can specify in which context you would like to connect, using which subscription, etc. But this way, when you do it once, not every time you start your computer, not every time you start Visual Studio, you do it only once. And then AZCLI stores of course, in Windows there's a secure vault in the system itself. It stores the token and refreshes it. And Visual Studio running your code knows that if it doesn't have the identity in itself, it should call AZCLI, and it will call it in the background. No code change needed. In the development and in the production, it is the same code, the same philosophy. The benefits of that, you don't need to share those credentials that you have or a single identity between developers. Yeah? Of course, we developers are nice people, everyone likes us, but sometimes somebody tired without money can just publish those credentials. This way, you can assign access rights to the specific developer. Yeah? When he leaves or when he changes the project, you just cut this access. And he can never tell anyone how to get to that. Simple, easy. And they are developing in .NET Core. Perfect, perfect. This Azure CLI, of course, you might know or not, but this... Yes, yes, but how do they run the code locally? Is it Linux or Windows? It's Linux. And they run the code locally on the dev machines. So they can install Azure command line interface in Linux. It works. PowerShell works, and Azure command line interface works. If this is your security policy that you don't allow those tools, of course you cannot do that. But Azure CLI can be installed in Linux. I use it in Linux. And it will work exactly the same for .NET Core in the debug mode. That it will also ask Azure CLI, so you don't need Visual Studio for that. That's why I shown this method, because .NET Core will also use it on the development machine. You can still use the same method for the developer. So just install AZCLI. If the developer has some identity in Azure, because you say they access portal, so they should log in using credentials with the CLI, and the app can run and will use managed identity to access resources. So in Linux, it's also possible. Most of the last 2 years, I did .NET Core in Linux. So yeah, I face this thing again. Easier, better. Why should you use credentials at all? Where can you find more examples? Of course, on docs.microsoft.com. If you forgot about the fact that Microsoft creates documentation, yes, they do, and it's getting better and better and better. What's even more important, when you see something that's not up to date in any parts of the documentations, you can immediately create a GitHub issue for the documentation, immediately. And take a look at those issues, because there are some very nice questions. When you read Microsoft documentation, please keep in mind those things that I told you about libraries. Still, some parts of the documentation, even official one, refer to the older libraries. So please remember it. Will we make our presentation available? So if not, you can write my email. I'll work here. Most of the time I'm here from the morning to the late night, so I can answer your emails. It's because I like it. Yeah, nobody forces me. You can write me. You can ask questions. Even now, after this presentation, we are a small group, so you can approach me and we can discuss your specific solutions. Yeah, if you need some advice on your solution, please write to me. I'll answer you and won't bill you for that. Yeah, I'll do it in my private time.